Join me, Mark Windows, for Windows on the World live every Sunday 9 to 11 p.m. GMT. Check out our archive and program stream at windowsontheworld.net.
Good evening, welcome to Windows on the World, and this week we're going to talk and look at a subject that we talk about a lot, propaganda. In fact, we talk about propaganda pretty much every week, and this week we're going to identify where news has actually ended up. In other words, it's ended up as PR. We talk about that quite a lot as well, but we've got a good way of fleshing it out this week, and we're going to look at that a bit later in the show. But first of all, let's go through a few of this week's most ludicrous stories. And of course, Jeremy Corbyn is still the victim of the attacks which have been going on for the past 2 years. And updates today. The founder of Tell Mama has described Jeremy Corbyn as poison. Now, you couldn't really make this up, could you? But they do. Faisal Mughal, OBE, no less, and useful idiot, and of course globalist tool of Tell Mama, which is basically a snitching service which Muslims have no faith in. He stuck his oar in and joined the Corbyn smear campaign this week. And it's quite incredible, isn't it? So we've got this new group, the independent group, where all of these subversives are defecting to, and they are getting absolutely loads of publicity in the mainstream media, and they are now starting to being given a kind of easy ride, comparatively with Corbyn. So this next item here is from Electronic Intifada, and again about Corbyn. It says Corbyn smear campaign. Now this is about an app called Act.il app, which is from the Israeli Strategic Affairs Ministry, and it's used basically to troll people. It's actually a troll army to spread false information about Jeremy Corbyn. Propagandists describe this as an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Well, just for a change, why wouldn't they? But the Act.il app, the people who make it are alleged to have $1 million to attack Corbyn. And it's based out of so-called media rooms in Israel. And they direct an army of 15,000 propagandists via the app. Now, this starts to make some sense when I look into what's been happening even to us at Windows on the World. Myself and Piers Corbyn have been attacked by what can only be described as these paid trolls. They try and align you, obviously, with the negative, and it's always done in the usual kind of very obvious way. You know, either you're a neo-Nazi, you're anti-Semitic, or there's something else. Maybe you deny climate change as well, you see. So we've had all these things thrown at us, and the ludicrous nature of it does tend to link up with the idea that it is indeed this Strategic Affairs Ministry, because the way that they go about it is so ludicrous and so over the top, and also there's no facts. So this is another thing. Obviously we're in the post-truth world and we know there are no facts needed anymore, but this kind of trolling, as they call it, is absolutely ridiculous. So just looking at the next item on here, this is actually from the Telegraph, and it says NHS transgender clinic accused of covering up negative impacts of puberty blockers. Dr. Michael Biggs, Oxford Department of Sociology, that's where he's from, he claims the Gender Identity Development Service is giving puberty blockers to young children. Now what this actually means is that they don't reach puberty properly. They actually have difficulty in relating to what sex they are. It says Governor of Tavistock and Portman NHS Foundation Trust resigned because of woefully inadequate care. This is something that happened recently following this. Now, up to 1,000 children have been treated with these puberty blockers, but after 1 year, a significant increase in female-born patients deliberately hurting or killing themselves has occurred. So, in other words, this is creating absolute epidemic of mental illness. And it says here that they were being accused of appeasing transgender lobby groups. Well, of course they have to, because once you're outside the narrow corridor of the accepted opinion, then that's exactly what happens. You get demonized. It happens to anybody who actually says anything half sensible these days. It says there's an increase in behavioral and emotional problems. An FOI, Freedom of Information request, stated, not knowing what effects this can have on the body. Basically, this is the quote that these people have come back with at this transgender clinic. They've said that these drugs, the puberty blockers, basically sounds like they're pretty much untested here, in that it says it's not known what effects this can have on the body. So yeah, human guinea pigs there being given these puberty blockers. They block sex hormones. By 2017, 800 had enrolled, including 230 under 14. The age group targeted was between 10 to 16. So that's all part of the agenda to absolutely destroy the minds of the young, so that they are absolutely dependent on the state and have no minds of their own. And talking of that, Greta Thunberg is now Woman of the Year in Sweden. Now, this is the 16-year-old with Asperger's who has been lauded by the UN, and of course Jean-Claude Juncker is going to give away a quarter of all euros to the cause of fighting global warming. In other words, mitigation. Mitigation is where the money is, as we've often said. But basically, this girl is being abused by the UN Disinformation Service and mercilessly pushed by her show business parents. We've actually put this on quite a lot. And there's lots of quotes from Greta, how wonderful it is that she's getting all of this attention. And she's obviously traumatized by the fact that the climate's changing. Well, someone really does need to tell her before she grows up, because when she does grow up and find out, she's going to be very annoyed. Now let's move on to Macron. And he says he blames yellow vests for a rise in alleged anti-Semitism. Now, the Alan Finkielkraut story, which was this guy that got abused in the street, was more to do with him supporting the paedophile Roman Polanski than actually being Jewish. And we've reported that in a recent show. But CNN France has seen an unprecedented public expression of hate, it says here. Oh, right, okay, so that's straight from the Ministry of Propaganda. Now, let's move on to something else here. 5. Yes, it's item 5 in the list here. Asda are removing single-sale kitchen knives from all stores amid spiralling violence on UK streets. So this is their answer to actually remove kitchen knives from their shelves. Now, obviously, this isn't going to stop people getting stabbed, but it shows you how ridiculous things are in the UK. And also, there is an epidemic of this knife crime, which again has been, in my view, promoted and propagated by the media. Now, before we move on to something else, which is the bigger picture of the propaganda industry and the background to it, let's look at another pointless display of narcissism as activism. Yes, Extinction Rebellion are at it again. The fake protest group run by the state-sponsored corporate globalization groups actually see our shows on this Extinction Rebellion fake protest, where we show the links to these groups' founders and their corporate partners. These entitled scroungers have taken money from the public to fund their activist narcissism. And basically, when you look what they're linked into, this is a corporate agenda to push climate change using a load of useful idiot narcissists who will actually do these stupid street theatre stunts which have nothing to do with the climate. This latest one was about them throwing buckets of what was meant to look like blood all over the pavement outside Parliament. And really, this is absolutely absurd, and it's what we have got to come to expect from this group. It said police stood by without making any arrests as the fake protesters spilled buckets of red dye representing blood, and they call this, get this, they call this a sea of blood. Now, what has this got to do with the UN climate change agenda? is anyone's guess. What has it got to do with anything? But it doesn't really have to, because the whole thing it's about a spectacle, and it's about narcissism. These people are hugely narcissistic, and this is their way of saving the world, by basically pulling these stunts, lying in the road, gluing themselves to doors and all the rest of it. But what it's got to do with battling climate change, even if it needed to be battled, is anybody's guess. But we've never let facts get in the way of a good bit of street theatre. So that's Extinction Rebellion at it again. And they've been organising these events up and down the country, funeral marches for their future. It's all about them, you see. It's all about me. So funeral marches for their future, blighted by an imaginary apocalypse, basically. And this has been happening up and down the country. In Scotland, they unfurled a banner, and get this is so ridiculous, that said, "Thank you for our suicide." You couldn't make it up, could you really? It's absolutely incredible. So we're going to move on to other things very soon. I just want to get this last story in, because it's quite important, this one. It's an international story. It's actually from the Bangkok Post. A Malaysian man has been jailed for 10 years for insulting Islam on social media. Now, this ties in to what's going on in the UK with censorship, but in a slightly different way. This is in Kuala Lumpur, and it says here, a Malaysian man was sentenced to more than 10 years jail, and 3 others were charged over insults against Islam and the Prophet Muhammad on social media, police said yesterday. The sentence is believed to be the harshest such penalty on record in the Muslim majority country. And it says, where concerns over racial and religious tensions have grown in recent months. So this is an interesting development, and it parallels what's going on in the UK and, of course, the West in general, the shutdown of free speech. Now, in the UK, it's mainly these Israeli lobbyists who are shutting down the free speech, but also we've now got people insulting Islam. We've had this before, obviously, but the sentence is believed to be the harshest such penalty on record in Kuala Lumpur. The Inspector General of Police, Mohammed Fuzi Harun, said in a statement, the person, who was not identified, had pled guilty to 10 charges of misusing communications networks. The offence carries a maximum penalty of 1 year in jail or a fine of up to 50,000 ringgit, which is 388,000 baht, which would be in Thai currency. So this is from Thai newspaper. But he says here, another social media user also pled guilty, and a sentencing hearing will be held tomorrow. 2 others had pleaded not guilty and were being held without bail. All 4 were charged under laws against causing racial disharmony, incitement and misusing communications networks. The police advised the public not to abuse social media or communication networks by uploading or sharing any form of provocation that can affect religious or racial sensitivities, causing racial tensions within this country's diverse community. Oh, we've got diverse communities all over the world now, haven't we? Isn't it strange, though, that they're all intolerant and they're all the same? All these diverse communities have no tolerance, and they're all about everyone having nothing to say of any importance or any interest. On Thursday, the ministers in charge of religious affairs, Mujahid Yusuf Rawa, said the Islamic Affairs Department had set up a unit to monitor communications insulting Islam and Muhammad. So there you go. They've now got their own monitoring system in place for anti-Islam posts. He said the ministry would not compromise on any acts insulting the religion and call for punishments against those who are found guilty. So that's a bit of a look at the latest pantomime of politics, subversion and, of course, slander. And it's getting to be pretty much the same few stories every week. Now, why is it? Why is it that we have the same few stories in the press every week? Well, listeners to this show will know pretty much why that is. But we're going to have a bit of a look this week at why and the background of it all. And I think that this will be very enlightening to people who have listened to our previous shows. And I'm going to be quoting some of an article, actually, a very good article from Off Guardian, and it's called The Propaganda Multiplier, How Global News Agencies and Western Media Report on Geopolitics. Basically, this is how this new form of rolling news, which came out of really the cable and satellite channels when they started, because basically you just have 2 or 3 stories that were run constantly, and that really contributed to the death of journalism. However, let's get into this. It says it is one of the most important aspects of our media system and yet hardly known to the public. Most of the international news coverage in Western media is provided by only 3 global news agencies based in New York, London and Paris. The key role played by these agencies means that Western media often report on the same topics, even using the same wording. Now, you can see videos of this where American TV channels all basically use the same quote, the same catchphrase. And of course, these people, most of the public think that, well, a majority of the public still think that these people write their own auto cues. Well, no, they don't, and they don't do their own research either. They're basically just presenters. But even worse than that, we have no journalists now. So journalists who work for so-called newspapers are just repeaters, and we're going to get into that, some really good examples of that as well. But it says, in addition, governments, military and intelligence services use these global news agencies as multipliers to spread their message around the world. Now, this is what we report on week after week when analysing these controlled narratives of public opinion. An example of this recently is the manufactured rise of the so-called far right by media outlets from the BBC to CNN. Now, this narrative came directly from MI5 in the UK. They were the first to report on it by announcing it through the, at the time, head of MI5, Mark Rowley, who's just about to resign. So we're just really looking into the bigger picture of how this all fits together. And it fits together in a very interesting way. So all the stuff that we've been covering over the past, say, 2 to 3 years is all explained in this quite interesting article which we've added to here. It says, feeding this narrative are a whole host of trickle-down propaganda reports such as the fringe insurgency, which cobbles together made-up and exaggerated threats, which is a thing that we've actually covered. It's a paper called The Fringe Insurgency, and it's typical of all of these papers which try and make a case that there is a massive rise in the far right, and it cobbles together made up and exaggerated threats from fringe groups which have ridiculously small membership and which nobody would really have heard of. So the fact that they are believed to be able to have any traction is ludicrous, and what they do is they tie all this together as though there's some big threat. It's just pure propaganda, and it's the most ridiculous kind of propaganda. All is supported by and latched onto by think tanks such as Demos and so-called anti-hate groups, which are just merely all part of a well-oiled ministry of propaganda. Again, we've reported on all of these groups. I mean, Demos are particularly bad because they actually facilitate a lot of these papers that come out, and along with the British Psychological Association, they produce the most absurd papers which not many people in the public actually read, but they do have an influence with these think tanks and NGOs and basically the rolling news media, because you often see Demos, people from Demos featured on Sky News and the BBC. But all these groups and charities, basically they reinforce the intelligence agency narratives which are fed to news agencies and copied by repeaters who just basically masquerade as journalists in this tightly controlled press outlets. I mean, if you look at the way this works, it's quite fascinating, because what you get now are these basically articles that are masquerading as news stories, and they're not. They could be actually described as advertising, because they're really just written by PR people. So I think this is a really interesting point, and one that we cover quite a lot. But to get your head around what's happening and the dumbing down of the media, I think this all really helps. But it says here, a study of the Syria war coverage by 9 leading European newspapers clearly illustrates these issues. Get this, 78% of all articles were based in whole or in part on agency reports, yet 0% on investigative research. This is such an important point. It says, moreover, 82% of all opinion pieces and interviews were in favour of the US and NATO intervention, while propaganda was attributed exclusively to the opposite side. What a surprise. The main source of information is stories from news agencies. The almost anonymously operating news agencies are, in a way, the key to world events. So what are the names of these agencies? Well, most of our listeners will know, but we'll get into that now. How do they work and who finances them? To judge how well one is informed about events in East and West, one should know the answers to these questions. This is actually from a document that they're quoting from. But it says this Swiss media researcher, Mr. Hone, and this was in 1977, he said this, the news agencies are the most important suppliers of material to mass media. No daily media outlet can manage without them. So the news agencies influence our image of the world. Above all, we get to know what they have selected. Now, that was going back to 1977. So I think things have deteriorated even more, and now we have the narrow corridor of accepted opinion, and of course basically Trump's a Nazi. Climate change deniers are people who do not go along with the 97%, which doesn't really exist, and of course anyone who votes Brexit is far right. But there are still a large section of the public who believe that what they see and hear is actually sourced by journalists, when the fact is that the majority of these just receive the information and repeat it. They often add pictures and flesh these press releases out with opinions or add-on stories. Now, this is a big point, because you often get these kind of articles that are really just tagged onto side issues. So you'll get something that is not even related to what they're talking about tagged on as a side issue, as if there's a connection. Well, there is a connection because they've made one, and you see this happening a hell of a lot in the mainstream press now. So that, yeah, they just flesh out these stories, these press releases basically, with opinions, or they add on these other stories. And it says agency contributions are exploited integrally without labelling them, or they are partially rewritten to make them appear as an editorial contribution. Now, this goes on all the time, and you can see examples of this pretty much every week. In fact, we covered some examples in the last few weeks. It carries on. In addition, there is a practice of spicing up agency reports with little effort. For example, unpublished agency reports are enriched with images and graphics and presented as comprehensive articles. Yeah, you see those, and some of them even have the Rockefeller Foundation logo next to them, because basically they've been written by the Rockefeller Foundation. Now, the Guardian is pretty guilty of this, because they put out these ludicrous scare stories about climate change every day, and they're always tagged on to something that isn't even true. Have a look at them and try and find any facts in them if you can, and you'll be really hard pushed. In fact, I would say it would be impossible. But as an example of repetition of hearsay, the majority of stories on climate change in The Guardian, again, just tagged pieces into doom-laden, so it's predictions. So they have these sort of doom-laden predictions based on no facts. And I can't reiterate that enough, because every single day in that newspaper, so-called newspaper, they have one of these ridiculous stories that doesn't make sense. So the people who write these depend on information with no factual basis. Now, I've had this problem with so-called journalists in the mainstream media who I've passed on really good stories to, very powerful stories, and if they were journalists, they would at least want to ask where I'd got the information from and check the sources out to see if it was true, because all of this is true and can be backed up, all of the stuff I sent to these people over the years, and none of them have printed any of it. And we're talking about quite big stories here. Even the takedown of Crime Stoppers, a guy at The Guardian wasn't interested in that whatsoever. He wasn't interested in the fact that the police were abusing that website and putting people on it who shouldn't be there. That's a national kind of interest issue, and these people are interested in that. So let's carry on with this. So what are the names of these news agencies that are always at the source of the story? There are now only 3 global agencies left. The American Associated Press, with over 4,000 employees worldwide. The AP belongs to US media companies and has its main editorial office in New York. AP News is used by around 12,000 international media outlets, reaching more than half of the world's population every day. Now, the quasi-governmental French Agence France Presse, AFP, based in Paris, has around 4,000 employees. The AFP sends over 3,000 stories and photos every day to media all over the world. Well, a picture tells 1,000 words, doesn't it? The British agency Reuters in London is privately owned, as we know, and employs just over 3,000 people. Reuters was acquired in 2008 by Canadian media entrepreneur Thomson. Now, Reuters Thomson are absolutely massive, and they have their fingers in an enormous amount of pies. So we're not just talking here about news and rolling news and press releases. We're talking about organizations which are basically change agent organizations pushing agendas. So this is where it all links together. However, it says what Thomson was one of the 25 richest people in the world, this Thomson, who actually joined with Reuters and merged into Thomson Reuters headquarters in New York. In addition, many countries run their own news agencies. However, when it comes to international news, these usually rely on the 3 global agencies and simply copy and translate their reports. Well, this is why it's all the same. So now the standards have dropped consistently, and the stories to be found in papers like, say, the Evening Standard, once it actually was a newspaper, and it did have, all right, some quite good opinion pieces in it, but that's now degenerated into something which is just slightly less dumb than its associate, the Metro. And it prints these short propaganda pieces which are nothing more than state PR or just advertisements. So they really are just PR or advertising. One fundamental problem, it says, is that the newsroom at ARD sources its information mainly from 3 sources: the news agencies DPA, AP, Reuters and AFP. What a surprise. 1 German, American and 1 British and 1 French. The editor working on a news topic only needs to select a few text passages on the screen that he considers essential, rearranging them and glue them together with a few flourishes. Now, this is exactly what they do. You see the same thing over and over again, and they just change a few words around, usually making it slightly incomprehensible in the process, because the actual literary standard that is allowed in newspapers would never have been allowed 20 years ago. You would never have seen spelling mistakes in headlines. You would have never seen grammatical errors in print. You just wouldn't see it. If it did happen, it would be a very rare thing. So now these things are kind of very common, and a lot of it's to do with internet news and things being written to the internet, because obviously some of these papers, they have stories which appear in their internet online editions which don't get put into print, and there's a very good reason for that, because a lot of these stories are absolute rubbish. And we've had experience of that, myself and Piers Corbyn. Piers has been a victim of these radical subversives who are working for third-party lobby interests and are controlling both parties in the UK. I think we know what we're talking about. And basically, they can put in whatever they want, and they don't even retract anything that's libelous, and they can just leave these things up there for days, and when you get onto them about it, they'll at some point they will actually pull the things down. But the whole thing is so lazy that it's kind of beyond what anyone could imagine would happen. And these schools of journalism, so-called schools of journalism, are now teaching people to actually express as journalists what they feel about an issue rather than the facts, or what they feel about an issue along with the facts. And of course that then turns into what they are led to believe. So moreover, it says in war zones, correspondents rarely venture out. Now this is a really funny thing, isn't it? Because you see them on the balconies of these hotels, or you used to, with a crash helmet on, with press written on it, or they're usually just outside the hotel in the street. So really there's no point of these people actually going to the places that they go to, because they don't actually get embedded on the ground. They don't actually go out. And this kind of backs it up. It says on the Syria war, for example, many journalists reported from cities such as Istanbul, Beirut, Cairo, or even from Cyprus. In addition, many journalists lack the language skills to understand local people and media. So this is basically, they get bussed in to a posh hotel, they sit around waiting to be called up to do a news report, piece to camera, and then they just go back to the minibar again. And this is kind of a well-known thing. I've talked to people who work for Reuters, and it's basically the way they operate. But I think anyone will be able to remember the very occasional walkabouts by the BBC repeater John Simpson, who would be filmed walking down the street with some poor people in the background. Even this street theatre, though, has been curtailed. You don't even see that much anymore. The odd BBC repeater who does report from the hotel balcony or somewhere outside the hotel in a tin hat has no clue what's really going on, and as we're saying, merely repeats the press release given to them. But check out our YouTube film, BBC Fake Reality Exposed, for some of the worst examples of fake news and made-up narratives coming out of the BBC. It's absolutely incredible, and those items in that video will blow the minds of people who haven't seen them altogether before. So I'd recommend anyone look at that. It's absolutely shocking when you put that to the test and think, well, wait a minute, are people thinking this is real? And yes, some people do think it is real. There are fewer of them now, though. It carries on. I'd imagined correspondents to be historians of the moment. When something important happened, they'd go after it, find out what was going on, and report on it. But I didn't go off to find out what was going on. That had been done long before. I went along to present an on-the-spot report. The editors in the Netherlands, they were talking to some guys, this is in this article, called when something happened. They faxed or emailed the press releases, and I'd retell them in my own words on the radio, or rework them into an article for the newspaper. Now that's exactly what they do, because they come up with a soundbite, and guess what? It's the same soundbite on every channel. So all they do is memorize a few lines, say them to camera, then go back to the hotel again. So this is the sort of thing we've been pointing out for a long time, but I think it's great seeing it in print like this. This carries on. It says, this was the reason my editors found it more important that I could be reached in the place itself than that I knew what was going on. So in other words, yes, here is our Kabul correspondent. Here's our man in Beirut. In fact, talking of Kabul, the ex-BBC Kabul correspondent actually was on one of our shows, and he said the reason he left the BBC was for exactly the reasons that are outlined here in this article. And we did several shows with him while I was at the People's Voice, and of course real journalists will not be able to tolerate doing this. It's beyond having no job satisfaction. It's basically just being a complete and utter useful idiot and having no job satisfaction whatsoever. But it says the news agents provided enough information for you to be able to write or talk your way through any crisis or summit meeting. So they just give you the bare points that you're going to talk about. Now, you can say that, yeah, but that's what they need. They do need to have these sound bites appearing and to keep it very simple. But it's not journalism. It has nothing to do with going and sourcing a story. And if you're a news correspondent or a so-called news correspondent, then you should be out there actually sourcing a story for yourself. Otherwise, what are you getting paid for? It carries on. The common idea about correspondents is that they have the story. But the reality is that the news is a conveyor belt in a bread factory. The correspondents stand at the end of the conveyor belt pretending we've baked that white loaf ourselves, while in fact all we've done is put it in its wrapping. Afterwards, a friend asked me how I'd managed to answer all the questions during those crosstalks every hour and without hesitation. When I told him that, like on the TV news, you knew all the questions in advance, his emailed response came packed with expletives. Now, this is it. So when people find out about the blatantly obvious, they're going to be quite annoyed. And I think it's actually so obvious now that I think a large number of people do realise that the propaganda coming out of places like the BBC is just that. And of course, the BBC's lost about 6 million viewers and listeners since 2012. I think nearly 1 million last year. We reported on that the other week. But he says, my friend had realised that for decades what he'd been watching and listening to on the news was pure theatre. Again, what I was saying at the beginning of the show. So we have Extinction Rebellion going out doing their stupid street theatre, which has nothing to do with climate change, which they know nothing about in the first place, because they've never read the founding document of the movement that they attach themselves to, which it's the UN SR15, the Special Report 15, which says we've got 12 years to change, otherwise something might go horribly wrong with the planet. But there's absolutely no evidence for that, and there's no facts in that document. So in a way, it's kind of surreality in that Extinction Rebellion follow a surreal narrative that's been put out by the UN with not one fact. And in fact, it's just basically a bunch of assumptions put together, and then they go out and distort it in their own special way, so the whole thing becomes a kind of weird pantomime, which is exactly what it is. Check out our show on Extinction Rebellion, Fake Reality Exposed, Extinction Rebellion. We've actually got all of their internal documents and we've printed them, and you can look at that, and then you can look at Greta Thunberg, the 16-year-old with Asperger's, who they've chosen to be Woman of the Year, and you will realise that this is beyond manipulation and it's beyond cynicism. However, although this is much more obvious now, there are still those who believe these press releases are sourced by journalists, and that's a really important point. In other words, the typical correspondent is in general not able to do independent research, but rather deals with and reinforces those topics that are already prescribed by the news agencies. It's called the notorious mainstream effect, it says here. The central role of news agencies also explains why in geopolitical conflicts most media use the same original sources. It says, for example, in the Syrian war, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. Now, this was ridiculous. This was like the Monty Python kind of idea of having someone who's a bastion of knowledge who knows nothing about it. It's absolutely ridiculous. It says, a dubious one-man-based organisation in London. It featured prominently. Now, the media rarely inquired directly at this observatory, as its operator was in fact difficult to reach, even for journalists. So it says, rather, the observatory delivered its stories to global agencies, which then forwarded them to thousands of media outlets, which in turn informed hundreds of millions of readers and viewers worldwide. The reason why the agencies of all places referred to this strange observatory in their reporting, and who really financed it, is a question that was rarely asked. Now, it's remarkable how this could even be possible, but I suppose when you've got the likes of Snopes having been involved in checking for fake news and fact-checking, well, this is hardly surprising, really, is it? But it carries on. The former chief editor of the German news agency DPA, Manfred Steffens, therefore states in his book The Business of News, a news story does not become more correct simply because one is able to provide a source for it. It is indeed rather questionable to trust a news story more just because a source is cited. Our sources say, and according to one source, are reasons to question everything that follows. So you get this an awful lot, don't you? Now, a source stated, and they never actually identify the source, which is going against the first rule of journalism, really. Sometimes you obviously have to keep your sources to yourself, but you have to actually back up that they're real. However, it says dependence on global agencies is also a major reason why media coverage of geopolitical conflicts is often superficial and erratic. Isn't that just the truth? So you'll get a story that comes up one day, completely disappears the next, to be replaced by another. So while historic relationships and background are fragmented or altogether absent, as put by Stephens, this is what he said, news agencies receive their impulses almost exclusively from current events and are therefore, by their very nature, historic. They are reluctant to add any more context than is strictly required. That's a really important thing, because when I did a journalism course, that was one of the things that was referred to, that you gave context but not more than required. Now, in the fast-moving world of news journalism, yes, you can see a point for that, but there's nothing wrong with writing a proper news story. In other words, with the times, the dates, who, when, where, what, why and whom. So it says what the agency does not report does not take place. Very important point. So lots of things recently have been left out of the news. We've actually covered many things that are left out of the mainstream narrative, because obviously there's only room for 3 things a day. But now this is an important point. It explains how things just disappear from the public. Yeah, and how things are repeated constantly when they're part of the totalitarian agenda. That's a really important point to get across, I think. Basically adding questionable stories. Well, it says adding questionable stories now. We're getting on to the next section. It says, while some topics do not appear at all in our media, other topics are very prominent, even though they shouldn't actually be. Of course, now we get these ludicrous stories that aren't really stories cropping up all the time. Just look at the news feed on something like Google, you'll find quite a few of them. Often the mass media, it carries on, do not report on reality, but on a constructed or staged reality. Several studies have shown that the mass media are predominantly determined by PR activities, and that passive receptive attitudes outweigh active researching ones. That's absolutely true. You do not get people who are interested in even finding out the truth anymore, and I'm talking about journalists here. They're interested in constructing a narrative which has been given to them with maybe 1 or 2 of their opinions thrown in. And we have covered a lot of this stuff over the past couple of years, so I think it's great to tie it up with this report. And it says that passive receptive attitudes outweigh active researching ones. Absolutely spot on. In fact, a fact due to the rather low journalistic performance of our media and their high dependence on a few news agencies, as we've just stated. So it says it is easy for interested parties to spread propaganda and disinformation in a supposedly respectable format to a worldwide audience. DPA editor Stephens warned of this danger. He said the critical sense gets more lulled the more respected the news agency or newspaper is. Someone who wants to introduce a questionable story into the world press only needs to try to put his story in a reasonably reputable agency to be sure that it then appears a little later in the others. Sometimes it happens that a hoax passes from agency to agency and becomes ever more credible. That was in 1969, this guy said that. And it's all been reflected and absolutely put out into the media that we have now en masse. So that quote was from 1969, and it's been all downhill from there. Among the most active actors in injecting questionable geopolitical news are the military and defence ministries. Oh yes, our favourites MI5 and their far-right narrative. For example, in 2009, the head of American news agency AP, Tom Curley, made public that the Pentagon employs more than 27,000 PR specialists who, with a budget of nearly $5 billion a year, are working the media and circulating targeted manipulations. In addition, high-ranking US generals had threatened that they would ruin the AP and him if the journalists reported too critically on the US military. And we've seen a lot of that over the past 5 to 10 years, and we've given examples of that. He says, despite or because of such threats, our media regularly publish dubious stories sourced to some unnamed informants from US defence circles. Now, this is especially noticeable in the reports from terror events, which often don't make sense and even contradict themselves. Now, see our previous shows and 7/7 Revisited, which we made on the 5th anniversary of the 7/7 bombings in 2010. Now, since then, there have been events which look in part fabricated, and all information is controlled by the intelligence services in these events, and no investigation by any news reporters working for the main 3 news PR agencies there. So this is really interesting. So you never get any actual reports and investigations after the event. You get the event, you get a narrative that the police come up with, you get some muppet from the police who's there to read a script, and then you get the BBC and the rest of the news media repeating it. So the US military, it says here, specifically uses the lack of transparency in media coverage for their deceptive manoeuvres. The way they spread information, which is then picked up and distributed by newspapers and broadcasters, makes it impossible for readers, listeners or viewers to trace the original source. Thus, the audience will fail to recognise the actual intention of the military. What an important and brilliant point that is. That quote was from 2003. Former CIA officer and whistleblower John Stockwell said of his work in the Angolan War, the basic theme was to make it look like an enemy aggression in Angola. So any kind of story that you could write and get into the media anywhere in the world that pushed that line, we did. 1/3 of my staff in this task force were covert action, were propagandists. That's 1/3 of my staff in this task force were covert action propagandists. Now, we've reported on this quite a lot recently, and even look at 7/7 Brigade, which is basically the it's the special operations psychological group of the army, with 1,500 trained army trolls trying to control the narrative on Facebook and Twitter. So none of this stuff is new. But it says 1/3 of my staff in this task force were covert action. That's incredible, isn't it? They were propagandists whose professional career job was to make up stories and finding ways of getting them into the press. The editors in most Western newspapers are not too sceptical of messages that conform to general views and prejudices. So we came up with another story, and it was kept going for weeks. But it was all fiction. And I think that's an incredible thing there, and a great way to sort of round up that show tonight, because all of this stuff we've covered for years on end, and the way that the media operates now is so blatantly obvious that I think that it's time, yes, to actually listen to people's own source their own stories. People have to actually now source their own stories, because there is so little coming out of the mainstream news. Now, we do report on that every week, to be fair, but we just a few stories to finish off here. UN Human Rights Rep demands full investigation on France's excessive force against yellow vests. Now, this is the latest yellow vest protest on Saturday. We now have had 3 months of yellow vest protests. It says UN Human Rights Chief Michelle Bachelet has called for a full investigation into reports of excessive use of force by the French police against yellow vest protesters, resulting in over 2,000 injured and dozens being maimed. Now, this is a good example of a media blackout in some ways, because those yellow vest protests are much bigger than the press are letting on, and they're trying now to say it's been infiltrated by radicals and it's all anti-Semites and it's all far right and all the usual rubbish. Well, it isn't. It's actually people who are going out onto the streets, and they have a lot of dedication for doing it. But it says, yes, 2,000 injured and dozens being maimed. The majority severe injuries among demonstrators have come from non-lethal crowd control weapons, which we've reported on, such as rubber bullets, tear gas and stun grenades. Attempts by human rights activists, it says here, and community leaders to roll back the use of these arms have been unsuccessful, leading some to accuse the government of complicity in the violence. So I think we're going to see the yellow vests absolutely demonised in the press. They already have been. The backlash started ages ago, but the thing is that the reality is very different, and all you have to do is look at the news feeds which are available on channels like Russia Today. You can watch the live news feeds of what is actually going on and how many people are actually there. So just to actually finish off tonight's show, I'd like to talk again about our talks, The Bigger Picture, which will be taking around again in April. Now, as part of the UK Stasi culture, a couple of our shows, our talks, have actually had venues pull out, and we think we know who's doing this. There are a group of subversives who attack free speech in this country, and we will be reporting on that. But I would like people to book The Bigger Picture and organise talks in their local area, because it's really powerful information and it's very down-to-earth information. We give the whole background of what happened with United Nations Agenda 21, which is Agenda 2030 now, and where that actually came from and what it actually is. Because if you do not understand what the reason is behind so-called regeneration and basically the smart cities agenda, then you're not really going to be able to cope with what's going to happen, because the actual rollout of this is very, very fast now, and there are ways of stopping these things locally. There's quite a few people who've done this, and we've reported on it. Take a look at some of our older articles, like Big Society Change Agents on windowsontheworld.net. Now, that article actually gives links to many other articles and many other sources of the information. So this template is being rolled out everywhere. And why isn't that in the news media? Well, because the so-called journalists and repeaters who actually get hold of this stuff would actually describe it as a conspiracy theory. They are actually that stupid. So I think that's really about the best place to leave tonight's show. I'm actually in another country at the moment. I'll be back in the UK in the middle of March, and we'll be carrying on doing our talks. So I'll be putting out some video reports when I get back. We will also be doing more on the weather, the changing climate and the agenda behind that, plus much more. So that's it from this week's show. I'm going to leave you with the trailer for The Bigger Picture, and we'll see you all same time next week.
The Bigger Picture, an amazing series of talks featuring Piers Corbyn, Mark Windows and Sandy Adams, bringing you the most important information you've probably never heard. There is a bigger picture going on behind the repetitive mantras of change, regeneration, diversity, vibrant communities and sustainability.
And they've gone through a plan which is the same on all of them.
Countries weren't taking this on. They just weren't. It was too much trouble. And something happened at the Johannesburg conference in 2002.
The corridor of power and control, decoded and explained.
The point is, a lot of these operatives don't know about Agenda 21. They just, that's what that council did, and this is what the Association of London Authorities says we ought to do, so let's do it. And the community. You just close down day centres, close down playgroups, create traffic problems. Okay. And destroy meeting places. Aylesbury Estate, the first thing they did once they decided to demolish was knock down the community centre in the middle.
I mean, I used to belong to the Ecology Party years ago, and that was real environmentalism. This has been hijacked. It's a Trojan horse.
They want to treble housing density and put flats for sale where not a single tenant on the flats in Danebury Avenue overlooking the park is allowed to return to a flat in Danebury Avenue overlooking the park. Not one.
Well, there you are. That's what the Club of Rome actually put in this report. It was their plan to make humanity have a common enemy. They thought global warming would fit the bill.
Labour, Conservative, Green, Liberal, it doesn't really matter, because none of them are going to address the main issue of what this is about, because they can't, because it's above them.
Did you know that in 2018, 64% of populations in so-called democracies state their governments rarely or never act in the public interest?
Lie one, lie two. There you go. Lie one would be atheism, lie two is organised religion. OK, so let's have the extreme left and the invented far right.
UK think tank Demos. The new democracy will work with a combination of government open infiltration and citizen groups taking direct action.
Change agents breaking down, you know. Oh no, I've got to go on another course after this, you know.
Where there's a problem, there's a solution.
Because it means that anyone who gets one of those forms does not have to sign it. And they've stopped it now, right? They've given them back to the council. So that affected hundreds of thousands of people in the country. If you engage with this stuff and learn a bit of it, it's remarkable what you can do. And I'm going to give you some more examples of that as we go along.
The global elite's aim is nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. The system was to control in a feudalistic fashion by the central banks of the world acting in concert through frequent conferences and private meetings. Carol Quigley, Tragedy and Hope, 1966. To book our talks on the bigger picture, contact us at info@windowsontheworld.net. Join me, Mark Windows, for Windows on the World live every Sunday 9 to 11 p.m. GMT. Check out our archive and programme stream at windowsontheworld.net.